Poštovani gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Ukrajinski rat traje već 3. godinu. Kraj mu se ne nazire, već upravo suprotno. Prijeti opasnom eskalacijom, više nego ikada do sada. Još prije Vašingtonskog NATO samita, generalni sekretar Jens Stoltenberg kazao je da Alijansa preuzima koordinaciju dopremanja oružja Ukrajini. Čelnici NATO-a najavili su daljnju vojnu podršku Ukrajini, uključujući sisteme protuzračne odbrane i obećanje da će potrošiti 40 milijardi eura za to. Najveća dodana vrijednost u odluci NATO-a jeste da od SAD-a preuzima ulogu koordinacije dopremanja naoružanja i vojne opreme Ukrajini u okviru projekta NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine. Ideja toga je da se osigura nastavak vojne podrške Ukrajini u slučaju da Donald Trump bude izabran u Bijelu kuću i pokuša obustaviti američku podršku Kijevu. Idemo slikom do Washingtona gdje se nalazi Walter Landgraf iz Instituta za izučavanje vanjske politike. Walter, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, let me begin by asking you, at the recent NATO summit in Washington, it was declared that Ukraine's path to NATO membership is irreversible and that the alliance is committed to long-term support for Kiev. Now, can you elaborate on the strategic implications of this pledge for NATO and for its member states?
Well, hi, Harun. It's a pleasure speaking with you today. Yes, as you said it, the NATO allies at the Washington summit in July pledged that Ukraine's membership in NATO was now on an irreversible course. There was a lot of movement and a lot of diplomatic horse trading behind the scenes to get this specific language into the summit declaration. What this does is it further commits NATO to a policy that there's obviously no consensus on at this time. The 32 allies do not agree that NATO will incorporate Ukraine as a full member at this time. And this is led mostly by the United States and Germany. Regarding the provision of long-term humanitarian, financial, and military aid to Ukraine, the allies will find this goal much easier to accomplish. And what they have done is pledged long-term financial commitment, military commitment, both at the bilateral level through individual allies giving to Ukraine and NATO collectively as an organization structuring and institutionalizing the support to Ukraine on a long-term basis.
Mm-hmm. Now, Walter, in light of the significant commitments made at the summit, including the provision of military equipment and training for Ukraine, how does NATO plan to ensure timely and effective delivery of these resources to support Ukraine's defenses against Russian invasion?
Right. Shortly after the Russian invasion in February 2022, the Ukraine Defense Contact Group was established by a group of about 50 countries, and most of which were NATO allies. And what this was a U.S. Department of Defense-led effort to structure, organize military aid, both lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine on a more predictable and a more coherent basis to allow both civilian and military planners in Ukraine to rely on that support in their military planning. What has happened now with the Washington summit and the volatility in American politics is NATO has made a move to bring this support, which is really on an ad hoc basis. Like I said, it was U.S. led for a couple of years. This group met on a monthly basis, but to bring this support under the NATO organization. And many critics out there say this is a way to kind of safeguard the provision of aid in the event that Donald Trump returns to the White House. And to a certain extent, it is. But what it does is it moves that aid and that support. It takes it really out of a U.S.-led effort. And make no doubt about it, U.S. leadership on this issue is crucial to Ukraine and crucial to the alliance. But it brings that support under the NATO with the hope and with the intent that will protect that from President Trump, who is very against further supporting Ukraine.
Right. So it's essentially a way of Trump-proofing military aid for Ukraine.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. It's Trump-proofing military aid to Ukraine, but to another, on a larger point, this sort of aid, the European allies have done a very courageous job on a bilateral level, providing aid to Ukraine. The Baltic states, the Nordic countries, Denmark, Germany, Poland, the list goes on. But this is a way to make that support to Ukraine more stable, more predictable, given the volatility in American politics at this moment.
Right. Russian officials have accused NATO of direct involvement in Ukraine's, assault on Kursk, even suggesting that, this could escalate the conflict. This is not the first time we hear such accusations coming from Moscow. Is NATO concerned that its arming of Ukraine can possibly draw it into the conflict in the long run?
Right. There's since this conflict began, there's the risk of escalation to the use of nuclear weapons, and Putin's saber rattling to that effect and his drawing of red lines to that effect has seemed to these lines have been crossed many, many times, and there hasn't really been many consequences with this. But I think on the broader point is the question of what constitutes direct involvement in the conflict. The Western allies and NATO as an organization providing non-lethal, lethal aid to Ukraine, training, education, professional military education, humanitarian support, financial support. The other side of the argument is that all of these things constitute direct involvement. So obviously the question seems to be troops on the ground, which some Western allies have proposed in the past, France namely among them. But also to the point of the Kursk incursion, which has happened in late August and is now over 30 days old. Ukrainian troops have now occupied up to 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory. But has this changed the dynamics of the conflict? And that question remains to be seen. To a certain extent, Ukraine may be using the Kursk incursion as some sort of a political bargaining chip in negotiations. But it has not seemed to really change the dynamics of the war as of yet.
Mm-hmm. Now, over the past couple of months, we have seen quite an increase in the number of, sort of sabotage attempts throughout Europe. We have seen unidentified drones flying over critical infrastructure in Germany. We've seen energy blackout. We have seen cyber attacks. Do you see most of this was actually blamed on Russia? We know that the U.S. has stepped up its security in its bases throughout Germany and Poland. Do you expect Russia to step up its hybrid warfare against the West?
Well, the U.S. bases and NATO bases across Europe have been dealing with these sorts of hybrid threats, whether it's cyber attacks, sabotage, misinformation, disinformation campaigns, terrorist threats for many, many years. And NATO and the allies and the host countries in the United States are very well rehearsed at dealing with these threats. What NATO has done in the past few years is really stepped up its cooperation between military and civilian emergency management officials, and has done this on a bilateral level, and has really done this across the alliance. So while these threats are significant and military and civilian officials need to safeguard against these threats, this is not something that NATO officials have not handled in the past, and I suspect that they are well trained and well rehearsed at dealing with these in the future.
Mm-hmm. You're based in the U.S. and now with the U.S. presidential election in full swing. I was wondering, to what extent is the war in Ukraine, and to what extent does it feature in the daily public debates when it comes to the campaigns of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris?
Right, it's part of the conversation. Obviously, it's foreign policy issues tend to take a back seat to domestic issues when it comes to U.S. political campaigns. As we saw in the debate last week, Ukraine featured quite a bit, and the contrast was very stark as far as what would happen regarding U.S. support to Ukraine if Kamala Harris were elected or if Donald Trump were reelected. And unfortunately, this has become a partisan political issue in the United States, and it has broken along party lines, with Republicans very much less willing to support Ukraine, and the Democrats more willing to support Ukraine financially, militarily, and through the NATO allies and partners.
Mm-hmm. Now let me ask you a couple of questions regarding the Western Balkans, where we are based. Talking about NATO enlargement, almost all Balkan states have joined the alliance, save for Bosnia, for Serbia, and for Kosovo. Is it important strategically for NATO to close this gap, quote unquote, and eventually incorporate all these states into the alliance at some point?
And NATO enlargement for many years has been driven by this vision of creating a Europe whole, free, and at peace. This has sort of undergirded the project, led in many ways by the United States, but obviously incorporating a country into the NATO alliance requires the consensus of all allies. Regarding the prospective membership of the three Western Balkan countries that are not members at this point, is this strategically important? I'm not so sure. I think what it is that there is symbolic value in NATO showing that the enlargement and fulfilling this vision of creating a Europe whole, free, and at peace is still on the march and is still relevant given Russia's intense, violent, manifest opposition to this process. But there are some really important technical issues here regarding Serbia, Kosovo, and Bosnia. Regarding Serbia, there's not widespread popular support for NATO membership, which NATO does require or does encourage. Regarding Kosovo, Kosovo is not even recognized as an independent state by all NATO members in the first place. Only 28 of 32 NATO members recognize Kosovo's independence. So obviously that is a large sticking point. And then regarding Bosnia, I would say Bosnia has the closest partnership with NATO of the three countries. Bosnia has had a membership action plan, which is the formal mechanism which guides partner countries to NATO membership. It has had this since 2010. But in many respects, Bosnia's membership is now parked because of a lack of stability, a lack of democratization, some backsliding in recent years, and most importantly, a lack of consensus within NATO about bringing the country in.
Mm-hmm. Now, how concerned are you about Russia relying and utilizing its proxies in the Western Balkans, its allies in Belgrade and in the Bosnian entity of Republic of Srpska, to push forward its agenda in this part of the region, to sort of try and destabilize the soft underbelly of NATO?
Right. So this is a technique that Russia has tried in many countries that are seeking to break out of a Russian sphere and integrate with Western institutions, whether it's NATO and the EU. We've seen this play out in Georgia. We've seen this play out in Moldova. Across countries that are either former Warsaw Pact members or former Soviet satellites that are seeking to break free of Russia's influence and join the West by joining these institutions. But a key element to this has been, in the case of Georgia and in the case of Ukraine especially, is this element of a shared border and territorial continuity. And this is what Russia really lacks in this situation. So that they're in the Balkans. So that to a certain extent, Russia can play on this anti-Western sentiment, but it can really do it only so far. And I think we as analysts and observers should not overstate and exaggerate the lengths to which Russia can simply turn up or turn down this, dissent or grievances within these countries.
Right. Walter, I really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you, Haran. It's been a real pleasure.
Njemačka vlada upozorava na nove napore Moskve da utječe na javno mnijenje kako u Njemačkoj, tako i širom Europske unije. Izraz hibridno ratovanje opisuje kompleksnu strategiju koja kombinira vojna sredstva sa nekonvencionalnim metodama u rasponu od povećanja ekonomskog pritiska, podmetanja požara, sve do širenja propagande i dezinformacija. Now, Glenn, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation to this beautiful country,
right.
Beautiful city.
Now, you very recently returned from Kiev, and over the last couple of weeks, I've been hearing some chatter about a supposed quote-unquote peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, based on the idea that Ukraine should effectively hand over a significant portion of those occupied territories in eastern and southeastern parts of the country. This, to me, sounds very much like the Dayton Peace Agreement back in the 1990s, which was signed in 1995. This is not the first time such an idea is being floated. In your view, is this a realistic path for peace? I mean, would this effectively legalize Putin's war of conquest?
Very good question. I want to stress we were not just in Kiev, but in other parts of Ukraine. The will of the Ukrainian people to defend their country is amazing, everything we've seen, and it was a pleasure being there, inspiring to be there as an American to see what the Ukrainians are up against and how they're not surrendering. In terms of the peace deal, well, let's leave that to Kiev to decide, for the Ukrainian people to decide on what is acceptable for them. Of course, nobody should allow the legitimization of the conquest of Ukrainian territory, is my personal opinion. The Ukrainians, if they decide to make a deal with Moscow, that should be up to them. It's a sovereign country. We should support them. But I think the Ukrainians are very understand that historically, Russia's neighbors have had to live with Russian aggression. And so whatever agreement may be reached, we need to remain committed to helping Ukraine defend itself. And other countries in the region, including Georgia, Moldova, who all face a threat of Russian aggression against them to take their territory. In the case of Moldova and Georgia, territory that's already been taken.
How would you define success in Ukraine from the Western American perspective?
I don't know if I can speak from the American perspective. From my personal perspective, success for Ukraine would be to continue to help the Ukrainians move towards integration in a direction, if this is what they want. If they want to integrate with the West, with the EU,
right.
We should help them do that. If they want to integrate with NATO, we should help them do that. We should continue to want to see Ukraine move towards prosperity. I've said for many years, Ukraine should not be seen as a threat to Russia. It should be seen as a bridge for Russia, for more prosperity for the Russian people. And I think that's what I would personally like to see. I wanted to see it before 2014, before 2022, and we shouldn't give up this goal. And one of the conclusions I had from the most recent trip that we had to Ukraine was that US and Western companies need to invest more and need to take more risk in getting into Ukraine now and working with the Ukrainians, not waiting until the war is over, because I don't know when that will be. And we can't afford to let the Ukrainians continue to suffer the way that they're suffering. They need to see Americans, they need to see Europeans side by side with them, investing in their country and sharing some of the know-how, and also the know-how that the Ukrainians have, which is pretty impressive.
You're very familiar with Turkey, and Turkey has working relations with both Russia and Ukraine. Now, it has been criticized by certain Western allies for not very openly or more openly siding with Ukraine. However, Turkey is in such a position that it has to balance with both countries. Is there a lack of understanding for Turkey's sovereign national interests and why it is carrying out such a foreign policy?
I personally believe there is. In the West, in Europe, in the United States, there's a lack of understanding. As I said during the conference, I think the Turks have done quite a bit for the Ukrainians. I personally do not think it's a bad thing that they're maintaining a dialogue with Moscow. They have strategic reasons why they need to do that. They have their strategic interests. That should not be something that we use to punish Turkey over or try to punish Turkey over. It's in our best interest in the US to maintain a good, strong relationship with Turkey, to show understanding for Turkey's geopolitical situation, and to help the Turks deal with a problem which started to be created in the 90s, which is overdependence on Russian energy sources and the Russian market for some of their products, for some of their companies. We need to offer the Turks an alternative if we don't want them to have to trade with Russia.
Right, but why is there still so much mistrust in Western capitals for Ankara?
I think that there's traditionally just a lack of understanding. Mm-hmm. Americans are not well educated about Turkey, about the history of the country, the history of the Ottoman Empire. It's not something that's taught widely in the US. It's something that we need to pay more attention to, given the importance of Turkey for the United States, given the importance of Turkey in the region. And of course, in Turkey, there are many people that misunderstand the United States as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a lack of understanding on both sides. But as an American, I will just be a little bit more critical of the U.S. We could do a better job of understanding the Turks, where they're coming from, and what their perspectives are.
Mm-hmm. Now, President Vladimir Putin, going back to Russia, President Vladimir Putin very heavily relies on historical narratives to shape Russian public opinion. How effective has this been as a strategy to support and sustain the war in Ukraine? And as economic hardships begin to kick in? And second, do you expect some sort of breaking point within the Russian society as a whole?
Well, President Putin's version of history is his version of history. It's a healthy dose of propaganda added into the version of history. I said all along, I think sometimes we shouldn't get distracted with the version of history that the Kremlin is pushing on people. We should remember that in 1991, Ukraine got its independence and its sovereignty, and we should respect that. The Russians should respect it. They were a guarantor of that sovereignty. They violated an agreement that they made.
The Budapest agreement.
The Budapest, yeah, of course. So history is important to know for sure, and to the credit of the Russians, they pay a lot of attention to understanding history. We in the West probably could do a better job, because a lot of the arguments they make, there are very valid counter-arguments to some of the arguments, or all the arguments that the Russians make. In terms of a breaking point, I don't want to comment on internal Russian affairs. What I do want to say is this war is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. The Russian people are not benefiting from this conflict. They're not gaining from this conflict. And there's so much more to be won if we could end the war and bring Ukraine more towards development, and eventually Russia.
And finally, let's look at things from a broader perspective. We have seen Russia grow its partnerships with various middle powers such as Turkey and Kazakhstan and India in a way to challenge Western diplomatic efforts to isolate it. Now, most of these countries are also members of BRICS. To what extent can BRICS serve as a crucial lifeline for Russia's economy? Can it in the first place?
It can provide some assistance, but I think the assistance for Russia is coming from elsewhere. right? Mainly from Beijing, and from sanctions evasion, from still people's reliance on Russian oil and gas, natural resources. And, I know there's a lot of criticism of, BRICS maybe in the West, or some concern. My own view is that if we're concerned about countries working with Russia, we need to offer them better alternatives than what the Russians offer them. And we can do that.
Right. Glenn, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you.
NATO savez je nedavno obilježio 75 godina postojanja. To je dosad najmoćnija i najdugotrajnija vojna alijansa u historiji. Međutim, nekonvencionalne metode ratovanja uzdrmale su taj savez. Rusija vodi opsežnu diverzantsku kampanju protiv NATO-a već 2 godine. Cilj je ometanje linija opskrbe Ukrajine i zastrašivanje donositelja odluka koji je podržavaju. Sigurnosni stručnjaci upozoravaju da se ova prijetnja može samo više širiti. Poštovani gledaoci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našem web portalu balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.